Mr. President, the famous Republican senator from Rhode Island, John Chafee, who was one of the authors of the Clean Water Act, would be sorry to see what has become of his party today and what's being done to the Clean Water Act that so many Republicans worked so hard for over so many years. The pretense is that some evil bureaucratic force at the EPA has leapt out to take over American farmers and ranchers. That's not what happened. The Supreme Court made decisions about what the Clean Water Act says, defining the navigable waters of the United States, and EPA had to follow the Supreme Court's guidance, which they did. And I believe they have been faithful to that Supreme Court guidance. They went through more than 1,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications. They did 400 public meetings. They had over 1 million comments on the proposed rule, and the vast majority of those comments were, guess what? In support of the rule. So what we have here is not some DC bureaucratic evil presence against ranchers and farmers across the country. What we really have here is a fight between upstream and downstream. And as Senator Barrasso very plainly said just a moment ago, the big players in this are the big special interests in agriculture, the big pork producers with their ginormous manure lagoons, the big commercial ag conglomerates. So if you want to be with them, fine. But let's not pretend that this is about protecting little ranchers and farmers. This is about upstream versus downstream. And I come from Rhode Island. I'm from a downstream state. And I got to say, if I were in big agriculture and I saw this rule, instead of coming in here and whining and complaining and yanking people's chains in order to get changes made, I would grab this rule and run like a bank robber, because this bill does so much for upstream agriculture at the expense of downstream fishermen, downstream aquaculture, downstream health of our rivers and bays. All agricultural exemptions and exclusions from Clean Water Act requirements that have existed for nearly 40 years have been retained. Well, we've learned a little bit since then about what goes on, and one place that I went to learn recently was over to Ohio. I spent the weekend in Ohio doing one of my climate tours of the different states of the Union, and in Ohio, I went here to Port Clinton on Lake Erie, and I was taken by the folks from Stone Laboratories and from some of the leading charter captains in this area off to the Bass Islands just offshore. And they told me about the algal bloom that took place in the Toledo area. Now, technically, this is not an algal bloom. Technically, it's cyanotic bacteria. It's a bacterial bloom. It was so thick that the fishing captains described that their boats slowed down in the muck. It was like running your powerboat through pudding. Toledo had to stop providing fresh water to its citizens and spent millions and millions of dollars having to import fresh water and provide bottled water. This lake, Lake Erie, is 2% of the water of all the Great Lakes, 50% of the fish. 2% of the water, 50% of the fish in the Great Lakes in Lake Erie. So it has a robust fishing economy for walleyes and perch, and the folks who go out and make this their livelihood, they don't think it's very funny, because this whole watershed feeds down into Lake Erie. And phosphorus, because of climate change, has driven rainbursts. The rains have powered up in this area, so the phosphorus is washing off the farmers' fields and coming down, and that is what is creating the cyanotic bacterial bloom in Lake Erie. So this upstream stuff makes a big difference to people who are downstream. And Wyoming doesn't have a lot of downstream. Wyoming doesn't have, it's a landlocked state, so I appreciate why the senator is so enthusiastic about this. But for those of us who are downstream, this is a rule that frankly is too weak. And the fact that we have to stand here and fight it from even getting more weak, from putting our rivers and our bays at even more risk, is very, very unfortunate. And it's not just phosphorus. Phosphorus is what happens to drive the bacteria growth in Lake Erie, but it's insecticides, it's nitrogen, and it's doing immense damage in our waterways. So I'll conclude where I began. If you're big agriculture and this is your special interest bill, you ought to run for it. Don't waste your time on this. Grab this existing Clean Water Act bill and go for it, like a bank robber with his money, because you got away with being able to continue to do immense damage to downstream resources without any regulation at all. And to now be here complaining, it's really amazing to those of us who are representing downstream states, downstream interests, downstream fisheries, downstream bays, and all the catchment areas like Lake Erie that get clobbered as a result of pollutants that flow into our waters. And with that, I will yield the floor.